This is July 1, 1994. This is Charles Lopez, taking memories as a child at the ranch for my children and grandchildren, Yvonne and Randy, Mark and Liz, Carla and Mike, Rachel, Michaela and Christina, and Edward and Debbie. My first recollection is of us living in two rooms. The kitchen and bedroom, both the roof and the floor, were dirt. And my brother and I were babies when we moved to the ranch from Albuquerque, probably in 1925. We must have lived with my grandpa's family till our two rooms were built. My grandpa was Juan de Dios Lopez, and my grandmother was Luisita Lucero Lopez. Grandpa's house was Z-shaped, had 3 bedrooms, a living room, a dining room, kitchen, and pantry. It was quite large. Also living at Grandpa's house at that time were Tio Donaciano and Tio Francisco, both my father's brothers, Isabel Ledger, a granddaughter that was raised by my grandmother, and Tia Agneda, who was a sister of my father's. My father had been hired to manage the big Monsimer Ranch, which was owned by a wealthy family living in Las Vegas, New Mexico. They trusted my dad to operate this ranch at a profit. He was responsible for the upkeep of all fences, and there were miles and miles of fence, and at least 10 windmills. Dad worked out of Grandpa's ranch where there were corrals, barns, big wooden storage boxes for corn and grain to feed the cows and horses. My grandfather's house, I remember, was very nice. To the north was the field where he planted corn, and to the east of the house he had a garden and a fruit orchard, and he raised all kinds of fresh vegetables. Since there was no refrigeration, fruit and vegetables had to be eaten as soon as they were ripe. And my grandfather had on the east side of the house a line of very tall poplar trees from north to south, which provided nice shade in the mornings. All conversation was in Spanish. My dad was a combat infantry veteran of the First World War, and he spoke good English. My mother had worked as a domestic with English-speaking families in Albuquerque, so she spoke English. But in those days, there was no need to speak English at the ranch. Today it's hard to imagine how isolated we were. The roads to Newkirk, Tucumcari, Montoya, and Santa Rosa were trails. Fence gates had to be opened and closed every few miles. Even cattle guards were not available till later. This was a device to let cars cross fences, but not cattle. Trips were made to buy provisions to Tucumcari maybe twice a year, to buy flour in 100-pound sacks, lard in 20-gallon buckets, chewing tobacco for my grandfather, and sacks of potatoes, everything needed for a household for 6 months at a time. Remember also that there were no radios, no electricity, no television, but strangely enough, there was a phone system from Newkirk to Bell Ranch, near where Conchas Dam is now. The cistern had been abandoned by the time I remember, but everybody still had that phone hanging in their living room like a piece of fine furniture. Summer is when most of the work had to be done. Planting was done in the spring using a horse-drawn plow to turn over the earth. Sugarcane was planted on 10 acres of fenced field east of our house across the arroyo. My brother and I spent summers hoeing weeds so plants would grow to harvest. It was really boring. Cattle had to be moved from pasture to pasture. Calves were born in the spring by the hundreds. All the work had to be done on horseback in constant heat, and there was no air conditioning. When I grew old enough to work, I used to help my dad and my grandfather plant. We hitched a team of mules to the plow with the reins around my father's shoulders. He would guide the mules with one hand, hold the plow upright with the other, and my job was to follow right behind and drop the seed by hand into the furrows. And on the return trip, the plow would cover the seed. It would take maybe a week to do all the planting. Again, that constant heat. Since there was no ice, we took drinking water in ceramic jugs covered in burlap sacking, which was supposed to cool the water by evaporation, but I doubt very much if it worked very well. But it was all we had. We went to lunch around noon. Nobody had any watches, but Dad could tell time just by looking up at the sun. We did have a wind-up clock at the house, so at 2 o'clock in the afternoon we would go back to work. Then we would work until around 5 p.m. From the time I was old enough to start working, I could see that my dad was already starting to get very sick. Sometimes he had trouble doing heavy work. Since I was always very healthy, and as I grew up, more and more he was depending on me to do a lot of the heavy work. When I was maybe 5 or 6 years old, my grandfather's dog had puppies. This was long before dog food had been invented. We fed the dogs scraps from the table. Since there was just enough food for us to eat, all surplus puppies had to be killed, and my grandpa put the pups in a tow bag and told me to take them to the arroyo just south of Grandpa's house, and he showed me how to crush their heads with a rock when I got to the arroyo. I just couldn't kill the pups, so I just turned them loose. I walked back to our house and later found out that the pups were back at Grandpa's house within an hour. And nothing was ever said to me about this incident. It's the only time that I disobeyed my grandfather. My dad's sisters were Tia Isabel Ledger, married to Tio Francisco Ledger. Tia Avelina was married to Tranquilino Lucero, and Tia Soledad was married to Tio Miguel Gutierrez. Tia Agneda was married to Julian Trujillo, and she died giving birth to her first child. The house consisted of the 4 rooms, kitchen and dining room and pantry combined. 1 bedroom north of the kitchen, living room, and bedroom to the east. We also had 2 locust trees planted to the east of the house for shade. As you look at it now, the fenced area around the house was clear of all trees and shrubs. Now it is overgrown. The clothesline for drying clothes was to the south of the house. In the kitchen we had a good wood-burning cooking stove. Next to it was a wooden box for the wood to burn. No electricity. Light at night was from a kerosene lamp hung on a nail on the wall near the stove. Since there was no indoor water supply, we would bring water in buckets from the well. The buckets were placed on a wooden stand. From there we drank with a dipper. We washed our hands and face, and my dad shaved. Also, my mother used this water for cooking. You can still see the pantry on the southwest corner of the kitchen. Looking at the house now abandoned and deserted, you must remember that the house was kept spotless by your grandmother. In the pantry was stored all of the food: beans in 100-pound sacks, flour in sacks, potatoes in sacks, coffee and all kinds of canned goods, fresh eggs, even leftovers, which had to be eaten quickly because there was no refrigeration. When you, Yvonne, Carla, and Edward were young, you remember the delicious meals that Grandma cooked when we visited them in Tucumcari. But in more modern circumstances, refrigeration and a gas range with thermometer. She had none of this equipment at the ranch, yet she baked the best bread, cakes, and pies. We used to have baked chicken a lot, turkey for Thanksgiving with all the trimmings. The well with the windmill was to the northwest of the house. To the southwest of the house was the garage for the car, a storage room for equipment such as saddles, a 55-gallon drum of gasoline for use by the ranch pickup, a 1934 pickup with a rack top like a convertible car. And it was on this pickup that I learned to drive. Near the garage we also had the hen house. We always kept 30 to 50 hens and a rooster. The hens laid their eggs in the hen house. We had to collect these eggs every afternoon, and just before dark, the hens would get into the hen house for the night. We would close the door and they would be safe from coyotes and foxes. But even then, once in a while, in the middle of the night, the hens would be alarmed, wake up and squawk so loud they woke us up. Obviously, there was coyotes or foxes trying to get in. We never bothered to get up since we knew that the hens were safe. To the west of the hen house, we had some corrals where we kept the milk cow and her calf at night so that it could be milked the next morning. After milking the cow and calf, it would be turned loose to graze all day. Late in the day, it was my job to find the milk cow and calf, bring her into the corral, feed her, and lock her up for the night, long before even antifreeze had been developed. And so we had to have plenty of water so that when the radiator in the car got hot, we could replace the water that had boiled out of it. In the wintertime, we had to empty the radiator every night, or else it would freeze and burst the radiator, and that way we couldn't go anyplace. One of the funny things about those trips, and we used to laugh about this after I was already grown up, was that every time we made a trip to Albuquerque back in those days, it was a custom that my father and mother had to get dressed up in their best clothes. I remember my dad wearing a necktie, one of those stiff collars that they used to wear in those days, a suit with a jacket, French cuffs, and the whole bit. My mother would wear her best dress, hat, and by the time we arrived in Albuquerque, you couldn't recognize them because their fine clothes were completely covered with dust. Later, after I was grown up and we used to talk about that, my dad used to wonder why it was necessary for them to get so dressed up for nothing. But that was a custom in those days, and that's what everybody else did. Traffic was so light on Highway 66, you might go for hours before seeing another car.